The heat inside the Hartman and Rick's construction trailer was oppressive, the air thick with dust that seeped in from the worksite. The portable AC hummed weakly as a group of engineers gathered around a whiteboard filled with elevation charts and foundation blueprints. It was just another day on the job, or so they thought. Standing near the back of the room, Darius King, a 42-year-old black man in a faded work shirt, took his place among the crew. His boots were caked in dust, and the edges of his uniform were worn from long hours under the Texas sun. His name tag read Darius King, but to the people in the room, he was just another laborer, just another guy on the crew. Bryce Langford, the chief structural engineer, stood at the front with a laser pointer in his hand, addressing the team with practiced authority. Bryce, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair and a smug air of superiority, was known for his aggressive decision-making and quick results. He was a graduate of Princeton, his degree often visible on his finger, in the form of a ring he wore like a crown. So, like I was saying, Bryce continued, his voice cutting through the room, we don't pay laborers to analyze structures. We pay them to follow orders. That's the chain of command, people. Darius didn't flinch. He stood there, his posture unwavering, his eyes on the blueprints spread out before him. His throat tightened, not from fear, but from the growing anger that was slowly building inside him. He'd tried to voice his concerns earlier, but now it seemed like nothing more than a joke to them, another black worker who didn't know his place. Bryce, with a smug grin, turned to address Darius directly. Can you please let the professionals speak? Darius remained silent, but his mind was racing. What had set him off wasn't just the mockery. It was the complete disregard for what he had pointed out, an issue with the northeast corner foundation. The slope of the land was causing lateral pressure that, if not corrected, would lead to major stress on the foundation. The structure could crack, and everyone knew it. Look, sir, Darius finally spoke up, his voice steady, but the tension in the air was palpable. The slope at the northeast corner is going to create misalignment stress. If it's not reinforced, the foundation's going to settle unevenly. That's just the reality of it. Bryce snorted, turning to the rest of the room. Did you hear that? Now the worker thinks he's an expert on foundation stress. Maybe I should give him my degree from Princeton. I could use a good laugh. A few engineers chuckled uneasily, not because it was funny, but because they knew better than to challenge Bryce. Darius didn't laugh. He didn't lower his gaze either. He simply closed the blueprint in front of him and calmly placed it on the table. His eyes remained locked with Bryce's, and for a moment, the room felt too quiet. No one had ever seen this side of Darius before. The quiet confidence, the calmness in the face of mockery. It made Bryce uneasy. This is why we have layers of management, Bryce sneered. People like me make the decisions. People like you just follow. Darius took a slow breath and stood up, folding the blueprint with care. The quiet was broken by the sound of his footsteps as he moved toward the back of the room, calmly slipping his old Nokia 3310 out of his pocket. The tension in the room was almost tangible as he typed out a short message, the fingers of his calloused hand pressing the buttons with precision. He hit send. The message read, V3G-D9. Ready now. Outside, the construction site was buzzing with activity. The workers, none of them aware of what was happening inside the trailer, carried on with their tasks. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as an argument over a minor issue was now something more, something that would change the course of the day. Bryce continued to talk, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Darius stood at the back of the room, his gaze unwavering. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. He could feel it in the air, the slow shift in power that no one in the room had noticed yet. The meeting droned on, but something had changed. The hierarchy that Bryce had spent years building, the power he wielded without question, was about to crumble. All it took was one simple message, one simple shift in control. Darius walked out of the trailer, his footsteps steady on the dusty ground. It was hot out, but the heat didn't bother him. He wasn't thinking about the work site or the endless hours ahead. His mind was focused on one thing, the message he had just sent. He could feel the shift, the change that had begun, and though he didn't know exactly when it would come, he knew it was coming. Bryce Langford was still inside the trailer, oblivious to the storm approaching. He had just finished his monologue on efficiency and cost management, eager to impress the team with his grand plans. He was so absorbed in his words, in his own importance, that he didn't see the signs of trouble lurking just below the surface. But as he spoke, a ripple of unease began to spread quietly through the room, starting with the younger engineers who had been too afraid to speak out earlier. Darius stood outside for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow. He could see the work site stretching out in front of him, the scaffolding rising steadily toward the sky. But for the first time, it felt like he was looking at it with new eyes. This wasn't just another project to him anymore. This wasn't just about cement and steel. It was about respect. It was about power. And it was about making sure that what was right never went unheard again. He pulled out his phone again, glancing at the message he had just sent. V3G-D9, ready now. Just 6 simple characters. But those characters were a signal to someone who would change everything. The phone vibrated in his hand. A quick reply. The name on the screen read Tom Morgan. No last name needed. Darius didn't need to see the rest. He already knew who it was. He opened the message. Confirmed. 1,445. Ready. Darius tucked the phone back into his pocket, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. It wasn't time yet. He had to wait. But he knew that when the time came, things would change, not just for him, but for everyone on this site. Inside the trailer, Bryce was finishing up his grand speech, still blissfully unaware of the shift happening outside. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, tapping his pen against the table as the engineers around him avoided his eyes. He had said what needed to be said in his mind. The project was moving forward. Nothing would stand in his way. But then, as he glanced at his phone, his expression faltered. A message flashed on the screen. Urgent. He opened it. Mr. Thomas C. Morgan will be on site in 15 minutes for an unannounced inspection. All management personnel must assemble immediately. Bryce's heart sank. The words unannounced inspection hit him like a cold wave, but it wasn't just the unannounced part that made him uneasy. It was the name, Thomas C. Morgan. The very name sent a shiver down his spine. Thomas Morgan was the founder of Eaglestone Constructions. He hadn't stepped foot on a job site in years, preferring to leave things in the hands of managers like Bryce. Thomas was a legend, a shadowy figure whose word was law, whose presence on the site meant trouble for anyone who had stepped out of line. Bryce's hand trembled slightly as he put the phone down. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes darting over the team. "Jared," he called his assistant in a low voice, "gather the engineers. I want every document in order. Get the drawings, get the inspection reports. We need to be perfect." Jared, the assistant, paused, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "You mean Mr. Morgan is really coming?" Bryce didn't respond. He simply gripped his phone harder, eyes scanning the screen again. The meeting had been routine. Everything had been going according to plan. Until now. Outside, Darius had already made his way to the back of the site, walking with purpose toward the workers' parking lot. His hands were steady, his pace unhurried. He had done his part. He had sent the message, and now it was time for the next step. He reached his car, a modest, weathered silver sedan. Nothing about it that screamed CEO. That was the point. He opened the trunk, carefully pulling out a briefcase that looked completely out of place next to his worn-out work jacket. Beneath it, there was a pressed white shirt, neatly folded. He slipped out of his dusty work clothes, changing quickly into the attire he would wear when the real work began. The sound of distant saws and drills mixed with the quiet hum of his own preparations. There was no rush, no reason to hurry. He had waited for this moment for years. As he adjusted his cufflinks and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, his expression softened. For the first time, he saw the man he had become. Not just the worker who was dismissed, not just the man overlooked. No, today he was something else. He was Thomas C. Morgan, the one who had always been there, the one who knew when to wait and when to act. Back at the trailer, the scene was a mix of frantic activity. Bryce was barking orders to everyone, but his eyes kept darting back to his phone. His mind was already racing. In just minutes, Thomas Morgan would be there. And if there was one thing Bryce knew for certain, it was that nothing good ever came from a surprise visit from the boss. As the distant sound of tires rolling over gravel reached his ears, he stood frozen, watching the construction gates. The Mercedes had arrived. The black Mercedes pulled up to the entrance of the Hartman and Ricks construction site, its tires crunching against the gravel. The sleek car came to a smooth stop, and the door opened. A tall figure in black stepped out, a security guard, standing at attention, his face expressionless. The driver's side door opened next, but it wasn't the man everyone was expecting to see. Bryce Langford stood frozen, his hands twitching at his sides. His mind raced as his eyes fixed on the figure stepping out of the car. His mouth went dry. The tall man in a sharp black suit wasn't just anyone. He knew this man. The man who stepped out was Darius King. But not the Darius King they all knew from the crew. This man was different. Darius King, now wearing a dark blue suit, a silver tie, and silver-rimmed glasses, was suddenly someone they couldn't ignore. Bryce's heart skipped a beat. The recognition hit him like a punch in the gut. It took him a moment to swallow the lump in his throat, but when he did, the words barely escaped his lips. "Mr. Morgan?" The cool, composed voice of Darius, no, Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan, as the business card in his hand would soon reveal, answered without hesitation, "Yes, it's me." For a moment, there was no sound. No one spoke. Not Bryce. Not the assistant next to him. Not even the engineers milling around. The quiet was deafening. Bryce was still processing, trying to make sense of the turn of events. The man he had just humiliated, the one who had been nothing more than a lowly construction worker in his eyes, was now standing before him as the CEO of Eaglestone Constructions. Thomas Carter Morgan, the founder, the one person whose name was a whisper of awe and fear around the office. Darius reached forward and extended his hand, a cold smile on his lips. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Langford. I've been meaning to have a conversation with you for quite some time." Bryce stared at his hand, the smile fading from his face. His mind raced back to the earlier meeting, to the mocking tone, the dismissive attitude. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. There was no explanation, no excuse. The reality of the situation sank in like lead. He had been the one underestimated. He had been the one mocked. And now, here he was, Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan, the man who controlled the company, standing before him, ready to see the truth of the project with his own eyes. "If you'll excuse me," Thomas continued, his voice measured but firm, "I'd like to see the site for myself." He turned to the assistant, who had been following Bryce's every command earlier. "Make sure the engineers are ready for an inspection." Bryce's assistant, Jared, nodded hesitantly, his gaze flicking nervously between Thomas and Bryce. Jared's face turned pale as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. He had seen the arrogance in Bryce earlier, the way he had dismissed Darius's concerns without a second thought. But now, with Thomas standing there, the roles had reversed. Bryce was no longer the confident engineer at the top of the food chain. He was a man exposed. As Thomas walked toward the construction site, Bryce was left standing, his thoughts scrambling. He felt the sting of every word he had thrown at Darius earlier, each one now like a knife twisting in his gut. His colleagues, the engineers who had once deferred to him, were now looking at him differently, some with pity, others with uncertainty. They had seen him as a leader, but now they saw him as someone who had clearly underestimated the man who had been standing in the trenches all along. It was as though the walls around Bryce were closing in. The air felt heavier. His chest tightened. He had once been the one in charge, the one who gave the orders, the one who people listened to. But now, standing in front of the man who had been silently working beneath him, all his power seemed hollow. His degree, his experience, his title, none of it mattered anymore. Inside, the engineers on site had already begun to sense the shift. Whispers spread like wildfire across the work crew. A few of them looked toward Bryce, expecting some sort of apology, some sort of acknowledgement of the mistake. But Bryce said nothing. Instead, he stood frozen, watching as Thomas made his way through the site, his every step deliberate, his eyes scanning the progress with a sharp, unyielding gaze. It wasn't just about the cracks in the foundation anymore. It was about something much larger, the cracks in the system. Bryce had been a part of that system, one where people were looked down upon for the work they did, their voices silenced because they didn't fit the mold. And now, it was all coming to a head. The cracks were no longer hidden beneath the surface. They were exposed for everyone to see. Thomas's gaze landed on Bryce, who stood watching him from a distance. There was no anger in Thomas's eyes, no need for confrontation. He simply knew the truth. He had known it for years, even before he had entered this room. That truth was simple. Everyone had a voice, and everyone had a place, no matter what title they held. Thomas's voice broke the silence, calm and authoritative. "I hope you understand now, Mr. Langford. The truth isn't found in the boardrooms. It's found in the foundations, where the real work happens." The tension in the air was palpable as Thomas led Bryce through the work site. Each step they took on the gravel paths felt like an echo in the heavy silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words. The workers, engineers, and foremen all paused in their tasks, eyes flicking between the two men as they passed. The realization of what had just unfolded was beginning to sink in for everyone. The workers, who had long been ignored and belittled, now watched as their silent hero walked beside the man who had once wielded power over them with such arrogance. It was a shift that no one had expected, least of all, Bryce. "Mr. Langford," Thomas began, his voice low and calm, but carrying the weight of authority, "I've seen enough. It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." Bryce's heart raced. He wanted to protest, to argue, but there was nothing he could say. His mistakes were too glaring, too undeniable. The cracks in the foundation weren't just a technical issue anymore. They were a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the company's culture. and the responsibility for that lay squarely on his shoulders. They walked back to the trailer, where the rest of the engineering team had gathered. Bryce felt the weight of their stares, their silence. The same engineers who had once looked to him for guidance now looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. They had witnessed his arrogance, his dismissive attitude toward the workers who were the backbone of the company. And now, they were witnessing his fall. Thomas paused just outside the trailer, turning to face the group. He didn't need to raise his voice. The strength of his presence was enough to command attention. "I don't have to tell you what's happened here today," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But I will. There's a fundamental problem at this company that needs to be addressed. It's not about just technical errors. It's about a culture of disrespect. A culture where those who do the real work are ignored, their voices silenced because they're seen as lesser. That ends today." The engineers exchanged looks, a few nodding in agreement. It wasn't just about the cracked foundation anymore. It was about a foundation of a different kind. The foundation of a company built on hierarchy, on power, on arrogance. And now, that foundation was crumbling. Thomas stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "Bryce Langford, you have been given every opportunity to lead, to teach, to learn. But you chose to ignore the voices around you. You chose to dismiss the people who matter most, the ones on the ground. And for that, you are no longer a part of this company." The words hit Bryce like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind racing for a way out, for some excuse, some reason why he shouldn't be held accountable. But there was nothing. No justification. No defense. "You have two choices," Thomas continued, his eyes narrowing. "You can step down voluntarily and accept a place at our technical training center, where you will work with those you've overlooked, without a salary, without a title, without the privilege you've always relied on. Or you can be terminated for your unethical behavior, your neglect of duty, and your violation of the company's standards." Bryce opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry. His hands trembled as he grasped for something, anything, to hold on to. The idea of walking away, of facing the humiliation, seemed unbearable. But the idea of being fired, of losing everything, his career, his reputation, was even worse. The room was silent as Bryce stood frozen, his mind spiraling. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, defeated. I'll take the voluntary resignation." Thomas nodded, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Good. This is your opportunity to rebuild. Not just your career, but your integrity. You'll spend the next 6 months at the Woodrow Technical Center teaching the next generation of workers, not because you're being punished, but because you need to understand the value of humility, of listening to those who actually know the work." The meeting continued. The engineers and workers began to shift, some exchanging glances of relief, others still processing what had just happened. The entire atmosphere of the room had changed. The power dynamics were no longer the same. The arrogance that had once defined the space was now being replaced by a sense of justice, a justice that had been long overdue. Outside, the workers continued their tasks, but there was a new energy in the air. They had witnessed a shift. They had seen a man who had once looked down on them, dismissing their voices, brought low by the very people he had once ignored. And now, they knew that things could be different. Bryce was no longer in control. He had lost his place in the company, but more importantly, he had lost the respect of the very people he had once looked down upon. As Thomas left the trailer, he paused at the door, turning back to face the group. "Let this be a lesson. A company is built on its people, not its titles. The true strength of this company lies in its foundation, its workers, its engineers, and yes, its leadership. When we listen to one another, we build something stronger. When we don't, we risk everything. And with that, he left the room, his steps echoing in the now silent trailer. 6 months had passed since the day that Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan revealed himself to the team. The construction site had changed, and so had the people who worked there. The company had begun to heal, slowly but steadily, as if the foundation of Eaglestone Constructions itself was being rebuilt from the ground up. But not just with cement and steel. With respect, humility, and a renewed sense of purpose. Thomas had kept his word. He had made the changes he promised, implementing a new culture of open dialogue and accountability. The workers who had once been invisible were now being heard. Their concerns were no longer dismissed by engineers or managers who thought their opinions didn't matter. Each worker, regardless of their rank, had the right to speak up, to challenge decisions, and to be taken seriously. And then there was Marcus Ellison. 6 months ago, Marcus had been the chief engineer, a man who held power, who had lived in a world where his expertise and authority were never questioned. But that Marcus was gone. Instead, there was a man who had learned humility the hard way. After being given the choice to either resign or spend 6 months teaching at the Woodrow Technical Training Center, Marcus chose the latter. He spent his time working with underprivileged youth, sharing his knowledge and experience, but also learning from them. He had been humbled, and it showed in everything he did now. It wasn't easy for him. He had to confront his own ego, the very thing that had caused his fall from grace. But as he stood in front of a classroom filled with eager young faces, he realized something. These kids, these workers, they were not just students. They were his teachers too. They had been the ones who had kept their heads down, who had kept quiet when things went wrong, and yet they were the ones who had carried the company on their backs. One afternoon, as Marcus stood in front of his class, a young woman raised her hand. "Mr. Marcus," she asked, "what do you do if you're in a situation where the boss is wrong, but you're scared to speak up?" Marcus paused, the question hanging in the air. He had faced that fear many times in his own career, but it was only now that he truly understood what it meant to be in their shoes. He thought for a moment, then replied, "You speak up. With respect. With understanding. But you speak up. If you don't, you're not just failing the project, you're failing yourself." It was a simple answer, but it was the truth. The same truth that had led him to this point. He had been wrong, he had failed. But now, he was learning to make it right. One step at a time. One student at a time. Across town, at Eaglestone's main office, Thomas sat at his desk, looking out over the city. He had received the updates from the Woodrow Center, and the numbers spoke for themselves. The program was a success. The safety rate on the construction sites had skyrocketed, and the workers who had once been dismissed as just laborers were now the ones who helped build the foundation of the company. But Thomas knew it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about something deeper, a change in mindset. The transformation was happening, not just in the company, but in the people who worked there. They had started to see themselves differently. They had started to believe in their own worth. As he sat in his office, Thomas received a knock on the door. He looked up to see Gregory Mitchell, the senior structural engineer, standing in the doorway. Gregory had been with the company since its early days, and Thomas respected him deeply. "Greg?" Thomas said with a smile. "Come in." Gregory stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He looked at Thomas with a knowing expression. "It's working, isn't it?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Yes, it is. I never thought I'd see the day when Marcus would be the one teaching. when he would be the one to lead. Gregory paused, as if reflecting on the change. But he's doing it, and I think he's finally getting it. He's not the same man he was 6 months ago. Thomas smiled, a quiet sense of pride in his heart. Neither are we. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the city. It was a new day for Eaglestone, one where humility, respect, and trust had replaced arrogance, power, and fear. The company was rebuilding, but more importantly, the people within it were rebuilding. Not just structures, but themselves. A few weeks later, at the construction site, Marcus stood on the scaffolding, watching as the workers continued their work. He wasn't the boss anymore. He didn't need to be. He had learned that leadership didn't come from titles or authority. It came from the people. And as he looked out over the site, he realized that this was where he was meant to be. Not as a chief engineer, not as a man who called the shots, but as a man who understood the value of every person, every hand that helped build the foundation. In the distance, he saw Darius, now fully in his role as the company's leader. Darius was moving through the workers, talking to them, listening to them. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a man who had earned their trust. And in that moment, Marcus knew that the company had been rebuilt, not from the ground up, but from the heart.